He was the one dog I couldn't ignore, even in traffic at noon. Every day he stood at the same corner in Chicago, Illinois, like he belonged there. He was big, built like a German Shepherd mix, but his coat had turned into dirty armor. Matted fur hung in heavy chunks, and I could see an old collar half buried in it, pressed deep into his neck. I thought I was just looking at another stray dog. A couple of months later, a vet would say something that made me realize he had been surviving out here far longer than any of us wanted to imagine. I'm not a dog person, and at over 40, I usually cross the street to avoid dogs that size. My name is Colin, and I kept telling myself to mind my own business while he just watched the crosswalk between the corner store and the tire shop. Most days he slept curled on bare concrete, back against the brick, flinching when a truck horn blasted, but never running. A skinny orange cat would slide in beside him, and he would shift just enough to share space. Sometimes another street dog came, and he would nose a scrap of food their way. The soda fridge in the store hummed behind me while people stepped around him without looking down. He seemed to wait for that little crew of animals, the ones who shared crumbs and never asked for anything else. The first day I bought a small bag of kibble. I dumped it near the alley, far from him, and walked off before he moved. Each day I set it a little closer until, by the end of the week, he was eating a few feet from his spot with the orange cat pressed against his side. Sometimes the loneliest dog doesn't look lonely, not until you notice his friends are the ones nobody else sees. The day that thought stuck, I knew leaving food on the concrete wasn't going to be enough for him much longer. The next week, he started showing up like clockwork, as if that busy corner belonged to him more than any of us. If I was there around noon in Chicago, that big German Shepherd mix would already be watching the crosswalk, waiting for whatever the day handed him. I began to notice he had a schedule. Early in the morning, he checked the same row of dented metal trash cans behind the corner store, nose deep in the lids before the city trucks came. By midday, he slid under the shadow of the same delivery truck by the tire shop, stretched out flat on the cool, oil-stained concrete. In the evening, just before the streetlights clicked on with that soft buzz, he met the orange cat and the other street dog like they had standing plans. His ears never stopped working. He kept scanning the street, eyes jumping from buses to bikes to anybody who lingered too long. But when the cat pressed against his side, his shoulders loosened, and his tail dropped from that stiff, straight line into something softer, almost like he remembered what calm felt like. One day I stood a few feet closer than usual, with a paper cup of gas station coffee warming my hands. I poured the kibble into my palm and held it out, arms stretched as far as it could go, feeling stupid and a little scared. He watched my face first, not my hand. Then he stepped in, slowly, and took the food with his lips so carefully he never touched my skin, and the second it was gone, he backed away to his corner as if there was an invisible line he wouldn't cross. The first real win with a stray dog isn't when they let you pet them, it's when they decide you're not a reason to run. That day, watching him chew and keep one eye on me, I knew we'd just taken a step I couldn't pretend hadn't happened. A few days after he took food from my hand, the wind finally showed me what he was really carrying on his neck. I was standing by the corner store again, rustling the same bag of kibble, when a gust rolled down the street and lifted the mats of fur along his shoulders. For a second, I could see under the tangled mess. There, buried deep in the clumps, was a collar, plastic and metal, swallowed up so far by the hair that I couldn't tell where it ended and his skin began. There was no fresh blood, nothing dramatic, just this hard line trapped inside him, like it had been tightening one day at a time. I realized whatever had started as a regular collar had turned into part of the prison he walked around in. A delivery guy stepped out of the tire shop behind him, and the dog went stone still. He didn't lunge or growl. He just froze and shifted his body so he could keep both of us in front of him, eyes flicking from the man to me. I tried easing a little to the side just to see how he'd react. He took one quiet step, then another, adjusting his angle so I never got behind him, like he'd learned the hard way that nothing good comes from someone at your back. The traffic light ticked over and the walk sign started chirping, but he stayed locked on us, tense, ready to move if we crossed some line he didn't trust. Only when the door closed and the street settled did his shoulders drop half an inch and his nose go back to the food. I stood there with the bag in my hand, feeling stupid and way out of my depth, and all I could see was that collar buried in his neck. I don't like big dogs, never have, and the idea of clipping a leash onto him made my palms sweat. But it hit me that if I did nothing, he would just keep shrinking inside that armor until there was nothing left of him but habits and pain. Sometimes compassion is just the moment your own fear finally feels smaller than the hurt you're watching someone else carry. Right there on that noisy Chicago corner, with my coffee cup cooling on the curb, I decided I was going to find a way to get him off that street and into a vet's hands, whether I felt ready or not. I knew I wasn't going to save him by dropping a metal cage on him. I pictured him slamming into the bars and breaking teeth and knew I couldn't do it. So I went slow. I bought a nylon leash at the corner store with his kibble, and the next day I laid it on the ground beside his bowl. The plastic buckle hit the concrete with a click, and he froze, staring at it like it was alive. He didn't run. He shifted his weight, circled once to keep both me and the leash in front of him, then stretched his neck, took a mouthful of food, and backed away again. His eyes kept jumping between the leash and my hands. For a few days, that was our routine. Leash down, bowl down, me sitting on the curb with a coffee cooling between my knees. Each day, he hesitated less before stepping over that strip of nylon. Then I started inching it closer while he ate. Just a drag, the leash scraping the sidewalk in a whisper. When it brushed his front paw, his body jolted, but he didn't bolt. He just stepped sideways, gave it a look, and went back to chewing. The day it finally touched his fur, I barely breathed. I let the loose end slide against his shoulder and waited for the explosion. Instead, he flinched, blinked, and lowered his head to the bowl again. His ears stayed tight, but he stayed. As he turned to leave, a flat piece of broken plastic by the curb caught in the mats along his side and dragged behind him. I heard it rattle, and without thinking, I let out a shaky laugh and said, "You're like Velcro, buddy. Everything sticks to you." The name wasn't cute. It was just true. When you give a name to a dog nobody saw, you're not just calling him, you're admitting he's someone. And after I called him Velcro, I knew there was no going back to pretending he was just another stray at my corner. The day I finally opened my car door for him, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. He sniffed the soft leash, then the open back seat, then looked back at the corner like he was checking his exit. I dropped a trail of kibble onto the floor mat and stepped away. He followed it one careful step at a time, all that matted German Shepherd mix fur brushing against the upholstery as he climbed in. When I closed the door, he froze so hard the whole car felt like it went quiet with him. On the drive to the clinic, he stood the whole time, legs locked, breathing fast. He didn't growl, didn't snap, just stared straight ahead, every bump in the road running up through his body. The old air vents rattled above us, blowing warm air that made the smell of his coat even stronger. At the clinic, they moved slowly, like they'd done this 1,000 times. The vet suggested we do the shave in stages with a light sedative to make it easier on him. Even as the medicine took the edge off, his eyes tracked every hand that came near his neck. When the clippers started, his first reaction was to go rigid. Then the fur began to slide off in thick sheets, hitting the floor like worn-out rugs. Underneath, his body looked smaller, like he'd been trapped inside a size that wasn't really his. One of the techs knelt beside him, fingers finding a patch of skin that was finally free along his shoulder. She scratched gently there and whispered things only he needed to hear. I watched his chest rise, then fall slower, and his head sank until his eyes closed. Sometimes a dog doesn't need a hero. He needs a quiet team that knows how to cut away not just the fur, but a little bit of the past that clung to it. Seeing him under bright store lights felt stranger than seeing him on the exam table. A few hours earlier, he'd been that matted German Shepherd mix on my corner in Chicago. Now he was shorn down, a little wobbly from the long day, standing in a pet aisle he'd never asked for. His body looked smaller without the armor of fur, ribs hinted under the new short coat, and he kept his tail low, almost tucked, as the automatic doors slid shut behind us with a soft hiss. He stayed close enough that his side brushed my leg, eyes scanning every person, every cartwheel, like the sidewalk had just grown a ceiling. We headed to the harness section first. I didn't want anything touching his neck if I could help it. One of the employees knelt a few feet away, turning the harness over in her hands so he could sniff it before it ever came near his body. When we slipped it on, he stiffened for a second, then stood still, feeling out where it sat on his chest and shoulders. He didn't fight it, just shifted his weight once, like he was adjusting to the idea that something could hold him without hurting him. We moved on to the food, on to the past long rows of bags that all promised the same things. I watched him more than the labels. His nose went toward the higher calorie food, and we picked something we could feed in small, steady meals instead of one big shock to his system. Then we found a bed, nothing fancy, just a soft pad big enough for him to stretch out on. He circled it twice, sniffed the seams, then stepped off again, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to claim anything that clean. The staff pointed us to brushes and a gentle shampoo, and to a toy meant for sniffing and searching, a kind of mat you hide treats in. They talked quietly, kept their distance, letting him decide when to close the gap. By the treat section, his tail was still low, but his nose finally lifted. He leaned forward, drawing in the smell of all those bags, and did this tiny, awkward half-step with his front paws, like his body forgot to be afraid for just a second. Watching him there, taking in a world that wasn't concrete and trash cans, it hit me that a first trip to a pet store for a former street dog isn't about spoiling him. It's about proving that from now on, life might actually give him things instead of just taking. We drove straight from the store to my uncle's place because I knew I couldn't keep a big rescue dog in my own small apartment long term. My uncle already lived with an old, calm dog and knew what street dogs could be like, so his door was the one that opened for us. Velcro hesitated at the threshold. No traffic noise, no tire shop, just the soft buzz of a hallway light and the distant ding of an elevator. He stood there, nose working, tail low, taking in a world that smelled like detergent, old wood, and another dog. Inside, he didn't go exploring. He walked the line between the front door and the living room, back and forth, as if he was measuring the distance to escape. Every time footsteps passed in the hall, his head snapped toward the door, and he stood still until the sound faded. The first night, with the TV on low and the old dog already asleep on a blanket, Velcro curled up directly in front of the door. He kept his back to it, face toward the room, like he was guarding both directions at once. He stayed half awake, eyes opening at every shift of the building, every pipe clicking in the wall. We made him a small, safe corner anyway. A simple mat, a bowl of water that was always full, and a spot where no one would step over him. We set feeding times and stuck to them, the same hours morning and night, so his world would start to feel less like guessing and more like a pattern. He watched us carry his things into that corner and still chose the doorway the next couple of nights. When the elevator dinged, he sat up. When keys turned in other locks, he stood and stared at the door until the hallway went quiet again. Dogs that have lived outside don't learn joy first. They learn how to stop expecting the next day to hurt. It would take time before Velcro believed that this front door wasn't going to close on him in the old way. A few weeks in, the building still made its noises, but Velcro's body didn't react the same way. The elevator would hum and ding, and instead of snapping upright, he'd just lift his head, listen, then lay it back down on his mat. He stopped sleeping, pressed against the front door. One night I came over and found him stretched out in his corner instead, ribs rising and falling slow, his back to the wall, his face toward the room instead of the exit. He could no longer see every way out at once, and he seemed okay with that. We made a habit of sitting on the floor with him in the evenings. The TV murmured in the background, and a cheap box fan rattled from the corner, pushing warm air around the living room. At first, he stayed a good distance away, watching us from the edge of the light, paws tight under him like he might spring up at any second. Then, little by little, he started closing the gap. If one of us sat cross-legged on the rug and didn't call him, he would eventually stand, think about it, and walk over. He'd touch his nose gently to a hand or a knee, stay for a breath or two, then wander back to his spot. On walks, he began as a straight line on a leash, muscles wired, head dragging us forward, eyes everywhere but on us. Over time, something shifted. He started to glance over his shoulder, not to check for threats, but to see who was at the other end of the leash. Sometimes he even looked up, right into our faces, as if weighing whether we were still with him. One afternoon, in a quiet patch of grass behind the building, he found a short stick, picked it up, and walked back toward us. He stood there, tail giving a small, uncertain wave, and placed it on the ground between us like a question. For a dog who'd spent years just surviving, that was the moment he wasn't just obeying or tolerating. He was asking for something. With dogs who carry old wounds, the real progress isn't in perfect commands. It's in the first time they invite you to play. By the time his coat started to look like a real coat again and not patches of repair work, it was time for a checkup. We brought Velcro back to the vet for what was supposed to be a simple visit, just to see how this former street dog was really doing. He walked into the exam room on his own, nails clicking on the tile, tail hanging, but not tucked. He stood near the wall first, eyes on the door, like he wanted to keep an exit in the picture even now. The overhead light hummed softly, and the paper on the table crackled every time he shifted his weight. The vet went slow, stethoscope to his chest, a hand along his spine, fingers checking the spots where the worst of the mats used to be. Velcro held still, head high, only his eyes moving as they followed each touch. Then the vet lifted his lips to look at his teeth. He frowned a little, the kind of frown you only see on someone counting years in their head. He scanned the microchip again, the reader beeped, and he turned to the computer. I'd always guessed Velcro was maybe 3, a young dog who just had a bad run and ended up on the street. The vet looked back at us and said, calm as anything, he's not 3. He's closer to 8. He's been surviving like this for most of his life. The chip had an old address from a suburb way outside Chicago, and the contact info was out of date. Numbers that didn't work anymore, a name that didn't tell us anything about who he used to be. There was no big scene, no shouting about what should have happened, just a quiet acceptance that going back wasn't an option and probably wasn't right for him anyway. What mattered was that Velcro had spent years out there building a life no one really saw. He'd learned which trash cans to trust, which alleys were safe, which animals were friends, and somehow he'd managed to keep a gentle side through all of it. Some homeless dogs aren't the result of a recent disaster. They're longtime survivors who went unseen for far too long. Knowing that, it felt less like we'd rescued a young stray and more like we were finally giving an old street veteran a chance to retire from constant survival. A year later, if you saw Velcro on the sidewalk, you'd never guess he was the same dog that used to haunt that Chicago corner. His coat is short now, clean and even, the kind that shines a little when the sun hits it just right. He moves differently too. There's weight on his frame, real muscle under the fur, and his steps don't have that rushed edge anymore. On walks, he settles into an easy pace, not dragging, not lagging, just matching the person at the other end of the leash. When my uncle slows down, Velcro feels it before I even notice. He stops, turns his head, and looks back, waiting until he's sure they're still together. Only then does he move on, like he understands that walks are something they do as a pair now, not a race to get anywhere. Around other dogs, he's still the same gentle soul I saw sharing scraps on the corner. He approaches with a low, relaxed tail, lets them do the talking first, and only joins in if they're calm. With cats, he goes even slower, giving them space, one step at a time, almost like he remembers that orange cat pressed against his side on cold concrete. Inside the apartment, he doesn't guard the exit anymore. He chooses his spot based on comfort, not survival. Some days it's the mat we bought, some days it's a patch of sun on the floor, and sometimes it's right at someone's feet, because that's where the quiet is. He comes for affection on his own terms now. No coaxing, no luring, just a soft nudge of his nose under a hand or heavy head landing on a knee. When he holds eye contact, it's steady, not searching for danger behind you, just checking in like you matter to him. He still carries his past in the way he pauses at open doors and studies new places before stepping in, but he doesn't live in that hard, armored mode anymore. The street taught him how to survive. This steady life is teaching him that he doesn't have to be on duty every second. The strongest thing we can do for a dog like Velcro isn't to wipe the street out of his memories. It's to give him a life so steady and predictable that the street finally stops being the only plan he has to stay alive. This video shows the path of a former street dog who wore a coat of heavy, matted fur like armor and spent years surviving on the edges of Chicago with only a few animal friends for company. Step by step, through food, trust, gentle capture, professional grooming and vet care, patient work on his fears, and a stable home, Velcro goes from a hyper-alert survivor to a confident, social, well-cared-for companion. It's a reminder that someone who never thought of himself as a dog person can still push past his fear when compassion gets loud enough. It shows how much skilled hands at a clinic can change a life that's been neglected for far too long. And it proves that a calm, responsible home can turn an invisible street veteran into a dog who doesn't just survive anymore, but quietly, fully lives. Thank you for watching.